How are you?
Great, man. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so everybody, I'm here with Sal The Agorist. First saw you on Twitter. I was just like scrolling. I saw some memes, and I was like, I thought, what is his name? And I saw Sal, and I read it as Sal the Algorist. So I was
Yeah,
I was following you for like a day, and I was like, does he like Al Gore or something? Um, yeah. So
we're the
uh,
opposite of Algorists.
yeah. Um, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm pretty new to libertarianism, so I've never heard of agorism, and so I got interested in it because of you. So if you could just tell everybody what is agorism.
Certainly, yeah. I look at it as synonymous with counter economics, which to me means the use of free market principles to subvert or undermine uh, cartels and monopolies that exist vis-a-vis state coercion. So things like, for example, Bitcoin to undermine the Federal Reserve, or 3D printers to disrupt the ATF, and that sort of thing.
Okay. Um, yeah. So what exactly is counter economics? I know. Well, what is and what isn't counter economics? Because I know a lot of agorism has to do with black markets. And so in a perfect agorist society, like what is and what isn't a part of that?
So, um, Per Byland, who is a fellow at Mises, and he is an economist at Oklahoma State. He's got an article that he wrote back in a long time ago. I think it was like 2006 for LouRockwell.com, where
Uh-huh.
he discusses two types of counter economics. So I think this is really important. This is really the crux of agorism. To really understand agorism, you have to understand this point that there's vertical and there's horizontal counter economics. So vertical counter economics would be things like creating local production facilities that bypass state regulations. So you could think of things like, again, like 3D printers are basically as local of a production facility as you can imagine, but also things like blockchain miners or aquaponic rigs, things like that. Any type of local, like I said, local production facility that bypasses a state regulation. And then on top of that, you have horizontal counter economics, which is simply just peer-to-peer voluntary transactions, mutually beneficial exchange, and that really is more associated with black markets and Sam Konkin,
Oh,
whereas
okay.
the former is more associated with Carl Hess. But I think it's a great article. Everybody should go check it out. I think it's called Counter Economic Strategies, and that's on LouRockwell.com.
Okay. I've seen a lot of stuff about a black market and then a gray market. So what is the gray market?
So a gray market is markets that are things that are legal, but they are regulated or taxed or things like that. Whereas in the black market, it's completely illegal. And then to contrast with the black market, there's the red market, which is both illegal and immoral, which is things like theft and murder, hitmen, contract killers, stuff like that.
Okay. And yeah. So under this, I guess you still consider any form of coercion to be illegal.
Well, no. I mean, the cops are very coercive. The Congress is very coercive, and they call their actions legal. I call it parasitism, but they call it legal. So it's certainly, it certainly is legal. It is immoral. It's definitely a violation of the non-aggression principle, but they call it legal.
Right. Okay. So why would you not want to take part in the political process at all? Why are you against the LP?
Well, I don't believe in asking other men for permission. I think that's to put it mildly, I think that's a form of cuckoldry, I guess, to go begging masters, and then, moreover, I think participating in the system almost makes you guilty. But, and I wrote an article on this topic for my blog back in like September or October called "Against the Partyarchy," and I really, when I was researching that article, what I discovered was that the odds are really intentionally stacked against us, right? So, in other words, they want us to participate in uh, electoral politics because that way we're controllable, right? Look what Gary Johnson did or Ron Paul. Whenever they got close, they just changed the rules to make victory less likely for them. So, what I like to say is that Cody Wilson did more for gun rights than every dollar ever donated to the NRA and every vote ever cast for a pro-gun candidate. Uh, Russ Ulbricht did more for free trade, to spread free trade, than any small government candidate in history. The same could be said for Satoshi Nakamoto, and the list goes on and on. I think that they want us to sort of focus our efforts on unproductive avenues, things that are just a waste of time.
I see where you're coming from with this, but I don't. Um, I guess what I don't understand is being against it completely. Like, I get what you're saying, where Cody Wilson has done more for gun rights, and technology and the internet has done for more for freedom of speech than anything else. But why? I mean, why wouldn't you support a Ron Paul for president?
Well, I don't want a president. I don't want any rulers. I don't care if it's my own mother or my father. I don't care if it's Ron Paul or Rand Paul or Mr. Paul or great grandpa Paul. I don't care who it is. I don't want any masters. With that being said, I do understand the point of you want to get the message out. And frankly, if it wasn't for Ron Paul, I never would have found the liberty movement and become an agorist. So I definitely understand that there's definitely a need to get out there and use a platform. I would prefer not to use a platform provided by the state. Um, but in the end, I just don't think it's also logically inconsistent to say, hey, look, we're free, but you better go out and vote for a new slave master. That's that to me is logically inconsistent, and agorism is all about logical consistency.
Okay. Um, I saw you had a podcast recently with Thaddeus Russell. One of the first things I ever got into reading was kind of like in the Pat Buchanan and Coulter vein. I was kind of going down that rabbit hole, and I found Renegade History of the United States, one of my favorite books. I was wondering if you're a fan of that.
I've never read it, but Pete Raymond has been telling me about it for months, so it's definitely on my list. And also, I heard it's definitely you could probably speak more on this than I could, but I heard it's definitely agorist friendly.
Oh yeah, definitely. Um, yeah, one of the main themes of the book is just how uh, it's it's not that the lower class influences culture, but it's the gutter class, one level below that. That's where culture comes from, and it ultimately influences everything. It was really interesting, and it challenges a lot of the uh, mainstream historical narratives. I was actually really excited when I read it because I felt like I've learned something, and this was kind of along my journey when I was realizing, uh, some of the stuff they teach you in public education is just bunk.
Oh man, it's bad. Mainstream history is one of the biggest lies ever told. The only place you won't get a true version of history is in a U.S. public school, even starting as far back as the War of 1812, and you can go on to the Mexican
Yeah.
American War and the Civil War. The Civil War is one of the greatest myths, I think, but also World War One, World War Two, Vietnam, all of our different mass murdering sprees and the different genocides that we and our ancestors have paid for. Uh, yeah, no, it's all made up. It's all lies. It's all lies. There's actually a great book. One of my favorite books is by Ralph Raico. It's called Great Wars and Great Leaders: A Libertarian Rebuttal. And that was really the book that opened my eyes to revisionist history. And that kind of took me down a rabbit hole. And that's where I went on to reading John Denson and I read Kirkpatrick Sale, and before you know it, I was reading Tom DiLorenzo and Abraham Lincoln, and that was it. And I couldn't believe how much I was lied to.
Yeah. Um, yeah, it's often interesting how people will just reject something like that. Like, I gave one of my coworkers, he's studying, I believe, American history, yeah, getting his master's. And I gave him a copy of Renegade History. He read like 20 pages of it and told me it's revisionist history and, therefore, it's all lies, I guess.
And it's funny because revisionist history has gotten a bad name, but in that book by Ralph Raico, he actually defines on the first page, he defines revisionist history as the unmasking of excuses for war making. So how that's bad, I'll never know. How that could ever be a bad thing, I will never understand. So to me, revisionist history is a great thing, and
Yeah.
we need as much revisionist history and revisionist historians as we can get our hand on. I'm planning on having on Earl Imes from the North. He's a curator at the North Carolina Museum of History to discuss Confederates of color, which is another wildly misunderstood topic in and of itself. But the whole Civil War period is as well. It's really that was in my opinion, that was really the era when the communists forcefully took over and successfully, unfortunately.
Really? Yeah, give me your take on Abraham Lincoln real quick.
I think he was a mass murdering lunatic. He developed as a child. He showed multiple signs of psychopathy. I did a couple episodes on Lincoln, and the more research you do on the man, the more disturbing it actually becomes. Never mind the constitutional violations, but the invasion of the South and how he manufactured it vis-a-vis the tariff enforcement really makes you sick to your stomach. And it just goes to show you how weak the American Constitution actually was, that it fell within a total of 60 something years. But Lincoln was responsible for or more than 700,000 deaths of Americans. It was the most deadly war in American history. He burnt, raped, and pillaged his way through South Carolina and Georgia, and it was all manufactured and based on lies. Right? It was all sold as he was freeing the slaves. Lincoln didn't free anybody. He freed no one. It's one of the biggest myths is when he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation is that he freed anyone, because if you think about it, the Emancipation only applied to the states in the South that were in rebellion. So now there were 4 states in the North that had slaves, but the Emancipation did not apply to them. Now, the states in the South were already in rebellion, and they weren't going to listen to Lincoln. They didn't care what he had to say. He wasn't their president, so he could make as many emancipations or proclamations as he desires. It has no effect on them. What it did do, though, it did encourage some slaves to rise up and violently become violent and stuff like that. Not that they were wrong to do so, but I do think that initial violence created by the Emancipation Proclamation is what led to the creation or helped facilitate the creation of the Ku Klux Klan and a century of Jim Crow laws and the racism that the South was cursed to. Um, but what I think is important to understand about Lincoln and the Civil War is that they were using tariff revenue from the South to fund all of this infrastructure and these infrastructure projects in the North. And they were running on this. These Northern Republicans were running on the fact that, hey, look, vote for us. We're going to build bridges and canals and all this good stuff. But they were getting the money from the South. So it was all just one big transfer of wealth. And the South did the right thing. States like South Carolina, the way the Constitution was designed was you weren't supposed to go to some Supreme Court, which is really just 9 lunatics in bat suits, is what the Supreme Court is. And they just issue rulings on high like there's some sort of deity. But that wasn't how it was supposed to be designed. If the Congress and the president were enforcing a law that was unconstitutional, states had the ability to choose not to enforce it, to nullify the law. So that all went out the window with the Civil War. Really, I mean, you can do the whole podcast on just the atrocities committed by Abraham Lincoln. And he wasn't the only one either. The other thing, too, I think is important to note with Lincoln is that the consolidation of power was just that was really a trend going on in the world at the time because you look, it was going on in Germany as well, and all of this led into World War I and the Holocaust. So really, guys like Lincoln and Bismarck, they set the stage for the bloodshed of the 20th century, for all of the horror and the mass murder that we saw governments commit. All these governments, they were just standing on the shoulders of guys like Lincoln and Bismarck. So I think that they get way too much credit, and I hope that one day I get to live to see Lincoln's statue torn down along with the rest of Mount Rushmore.
Wow. That's so against everything you're taught. I mean, that's Lincoln's the guy, man. You ask these presidential candidates, oh, who's your favorite president of all time? Oh, Lincoln. That's the go-to. That's the safe choice.
Well, it makes sense
But
because he was like the first socialist. He was the first
yeah,
true psychopath. You know, when he was a child, his father used to keep dogs, and this is something I covered in my podcast. His father had a bunch of dogs, and Lincoln would try to avoid work on the farm. So what he would do is he would try to sneak off. And what would happen is this one particular dog would always bark every time Lincoln ran away, and his father would come out and catch him, and he would force him to come back to work. So Honest Abe, as we're taught in public school, got it into his head to sew a coonskin onto this particular dog while it was alive and watch the other dogs maul him to death. So this is not the brain of a normal
what?
individual. Yeah, this is the
That
yeah, this is all
okay.
true.
That's the first thing I'm doing after this is looking that up.
Yeah, we
What?
won't. You won't learn this in the public school. But these are the people who the state worships, which just goes to show you we are ruled by a bunch of monsters and lunatics and sociopaths.
Yeah. Going back to the Proclamation, you're exactly right. He could have issued something like that at any point. It's all it is just a letter. But he waited until he knew that it would have no effect to issue it out and
And,
just used it as a tool.
and the four states where he could have actually freed the slaves, the ones in the north, he left them alone. Not to
Yep.
mention the fact that there were multiple times where he could have emancipated the slaves, and he declined it. For example, the Fremont Emancipation, or for example, he rejected the Crittenden resolutions, which were designed to slowly bring slavery to a halt. He also rejected the idea of compensated emancipation, which was how they did it in Europe. You know, it's funny because all the other countries around the world in the West that had slaves, what happened to their slaves? They got rid of slaves, but they didn't have a civil war. So why were they able to do it, but Lincoln wasn't? And why do we revere this man as a hero when he lost 700,000 lives in the process?
Yeah. It's absolutely insane. But yeah, I'm curious as to how you found agorism. Have you always been a libertarian? What kind of sent you down this path?
Oh man, when I was younger, I was a warmongering neoconservative. It was
Yeah, me
bad.
too.
And yeah, it's embarrassing to tell you the truth when I think of some of the arguments I used to make.
Yep.
Um, and then I went to college, and I kind of got lucky because I did have some liberty-friendly professors who helped me see certain things in perspective, like the Federal Reserve and the Constitution and stuff like that. But really, what did it for me was the Ron Paul debates. I don't remember if it was 2008 or 2012, but I remember, looking at all the Republican candidates, trying to decide who I should vote for, and thinking to myself, they all sound like a bunch of communists, and the only one who makes any sense is the guy who I'm supposed to think is crazy. So what's going on here? And then I started YouTubing and I started Googling, and one thing led to another. And before long, I was reading Murray Rothbard and watching Ralph Raico history lectures, and that was the end of that.
Yeah. For me, yeah, early on I was kind of in that neocon sphere. Kind of became apolitical, had that kind of like I I don't know, like Netflix, like normie mindset.
Right, right.
Uh, then something about the Trump campaign got me riled up, hit some of my sore spots, go down this like new right rabbit hole, that Michael Malice's The New Right, man, it I read that, the day it came out, and it's like to a T, like my experience of how you're just like he says you're supposed to take one red pill, not the whole bottle,
Yeah.
and I took the whole bottle,
Right. Right.
right?
Right.
So, but yeah, it was eventually I stumbled on Anatomy of the State and Defending the Undefendable, and I was just awakened by that.
Two classics. Two classics.
Yeah.
Especially
So
Defending the Undefendable. That's a big one for agorism as well, because as you know that it's all black markets and gray market activity.
uh yeah, defending the undefendable was good too because it's more of a thought experiment. You start thinking about, well, what if prostitution could be okay, and then you're on to, well, actually, blackmail is not uh, shouldn't be
Right.
illegal. There's a big case for it, and it would actually do a lot of good to legalize blackmail.
I
That's
saw I saw you had Walter Block on for
yeah.
the previous episode, and I'll tell you what, he's my favorite economist because his logic is so precise and so cutting that he's able somehow to avoid any bias, and he only sticks with the logic, and that's what I love. And like you said, blackmail, or when he talks about how pimping is actually just a form of brokerage. I mean, it's just so simple that we were taught not to think this way. But when he has a way of pulling back that veil that's sort of shocking and surprises the reader.
Yeah, he's so humble about it too. It's, tell him basically the same thing that you just said, and he's like, "Oh no," and then he just goes on about Rothbard and, and
Yeah,
Ayn
I don't
Rand.
think I don't think Professor Block truly realizes his own importance in the movement, because I think when guys like him, God forbid, knock wood, when guys like him pass away, they're going to be remembered the same way that we look back on, Mises and Rothbard today. We're going to look back at the Walter Blocks of the world like that. So that's why I think it's important to get him on as many podcasts as possible and get as
Yeah,
much
definitely.
information out of him as we possibly can.
Yeah. What do you think about evictionism?
About what?
Evictionism is a
Abortion.
abortion stance.
Yeah, abortion is, to me, it certainly is the hardest topic from a libertarian perspective. Um, let's put it like this: every time I've ever disagreed with Walter Block, if he keeps explaining within 10 to 15 minutes, he usually brings me into a state of agreement. However, with that said, on the surface, I'm really not a fan of evictionism. Um, the way I look at it is. No one knows, right? The whole issue of abortion comes down to, when does life begin, and no one knows. Nobody knows when that embryo actually becomes a person. So to me, it's a moral decision, and I don't have the answer. I don't think anybody does have the answer. So it's probably best left in the individual's hands. That being said, personally, I don't approve of it in my life. I don't. I don't. I want to see a world with zero abortions, but I think that change has to start at the dinner table and not at, in a congressional back room. Does that make
Yeah,
any sense?
definitely. Yeah. Um, One of the things that's frustrating for me about politics is just seeing people argue from bad positions. And I'm constantly seeing conservatives, libertarians, basically anybody pro life arguing this scenario that's, less than 1% of abortions, case of like incest and rape. And they always argue with that frame of mind. And yeah. So it's just frustrating to see that. And as far as the LP is concerned, I think there's a lot more that can be done in terms of strategy. Why do you think the LP is so bad at it?
I don't think it's possible, right? It's not possible to fix the system from within the system. It's almost like saying, like, I grew up in like New York, New Jersey, so when I was a kid, the big thing around here was like the Gambinos, and John Gotti was like a big issue in the news. And it sort of reminds me of the mafia, because you wouldn't, if you wanted to fight the Gambinos, you wouldn't start your own little group of gangsters and then go up to John Gotti and say, "Hey, listen, do you think we could join your club, Mr. Gambino? And then hopefully, we can work our way up, and one day I can be the boss of the family, and then from then we're going to make sure we stop the murders and the extortions." It doesn't make any sense. If you think about it, even if the Libertarian Party takes over, they're still going to be running militaries and courts and roads and police. So it's really just a different form of socialism. It's really just we're trading one set of socialist policies for another, and it's all nonsense to me. The only feasible solution is one based on free markets, and this was proven by Ludwig von Mises in his little book, Economic Calculation in a Socialist Commonwealth. He proved deductively that it's not possible for the state to have any sort of economic planning accurately whatsoever. So at this point, as far as I'm concerned, the black market is the only truly anarchic market. It's the only true free market. So let's focus on the black and gray markets, and we'll actually try to innovate and change things and using technology and entrepreneurship rather than begging our masters for incremental change. It just doesn't make any sense. And then even like I said, even when we do make progress, like when Ron Paul was going to win, he did really well. They just changed the rules. They're never going to let somebody win whose idea is to take power away from the state. The going back to the Gambinos, they wouldn't voluntarily give up blocks of New York City, right? It's not going to happen. Why would they give up, territory in the United States?
Yeah, I'm constantly amazed at some of the Republicans running that claim I want to reduce the size of government. None of them come anywhere close to ever doing that, but that's what people vote based on is they say that and they lie about that, and then your typical Republican will end up voting for them.
And then loyally too. Then they'll go back after they
Yep.
get screwed. They'll go back to the polls. Then they'll get screwed again. And they'll go back to the polls. I mean, this is the definition of insanity. Voting literally is the definition of insanity. Um, you know, Trump and the Republican Congress before the Democrats took the House, they had what, 2 years of they had the Supreme Court, they had all of the federal courts, they had the House of Representatives, the Senate, they had the presidency, the vice presidency, all of the cabinet positions, and they couldn't even get a balanced budget passed. I mean, it's a big joke. They couldn't get anything done. Frankly, they couldn't. There was no progress on gun control or any of these different things that the Republicans thought they were going to get. They got none of it because the Republicans are socialists and the Democrats are communists. It's all based on collectivism, and it's all garbage. It's all nonsense. It's all parasitism, and that's why I'm focused on creating and promoting change. And as Sam Conkin said, action. Action is the key. You can't
Yep.
have any change without action.
Yeah. So with that being said, are you optimistic about the future of personal liberty?
Yeah, I am, but I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think everyone should read a book called The New Libertarian Manifesto by Sam Conkin, and also check out a book by J. Neil Schulman called Alongside Night. And those two books will sort of walk you through the Agorist revolution, because there's going to be four phases, according to Conkin. And in phase one, we have where it's dominated by the state, and then phase four is dominated by agorists, and the two transitionary stages in the beginning. But in Neil's book, he really goes in depth into how this is going to look, and he really paints a picture and illustrates it for us. And it's going to get ugly. Eventually, what we're going to see is we're going to have, we believe at least, that we're going to have private defense agencies that will begin by competing with police for protection services. And we see things like this already starting with, for example, Dale Brown and the Detroit Threat Management Center. And there's other examples too. But eventually, these private defense agencies, these PDAs, are going to move into more of a competitive role with the local police services, and they're going to end up actually protecting individuals from the police, right? From the extortion of the tax man and from, the police shooting your children. You're going to be protected by private defense agencies, and as time goes on, they're going to become more and more powerful, and the state's going to become less and less powerful. And eventually, we're going to get to a free society like this.
Wow. Yeah, that kind of just blew my mind, actually.
Yeah, if you
it,
read
it
along,
it it makes sense, actually.
if you read alongside Knight, he really walks you through it very well, and that's actually the book. I don't know if you're familiar with Ross Ulbricht, a real hero, just an absolutely wonderful individual who sacrificed his life for the rest of us and for the good of humanity. But that was the book that influenced him to create the Silk Road and a truly free market. So that's a great book. Those are really the two main books I'd recommend in terms of agorism. Also, check out Community Technology by Carl Hess. It's another one. So
Okay. Um, Drop some other controversial woke history facts on us.
say that again.
Drop some other controversial facts about history on us.
Sure. Well, Winston Churchill was a madman. That's another one. Again, in that same book I recommended, Great Wars and Great Leaders, there's a whole
Uh-huh.
chapter in there about Winston Churchill. And he was really a real lunatic. He was just obsessed with the concept of warfare from the day he was a small child. I think Ralph Rako says he was a man who had no principles. It was just the love of war. And that is really, he was the one who really pulled us into World War One, which Woodrow Wilson was all too happy to comply with. And that was what created, of course, the Treaty of Versailles. And then that led to World War Two and the Holocaust. And, another one is Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a terrible, terrible lie, uh, all concocted by the Roosevelt administration to draw us into this war, again, to help Churchill. But Pearl Harbor was just absolutely awful because we were warned of it by the Japanese ambassadors uh, earlier that day.
Yeah,
You know, the
I'm
Jap-
familiar with that one. That's in Tom Wood's politically incorrect guide to history. I think that's called. Yeah,
Okay, yeah, I haven't read that one, but I think
that
I
one's
think
in
I
there.
read that in John Denson's book Century of War. But
Hmm.
all of history is essentially a big lie. Even the Mexican American War and how it was started was a lie. The Civil War obviously was a lie. Um, the Whiskey Rebellion. People treat George Washington as this, great hero of liberty and the Republic. And he wasn't bad to begin with. When he was, shooting redcoats, he was great as far as the libertarians are concerned. It was, you want to shoot tax collectors, have
Right.
at it. But when you start enforcing that tax on individuals, then at that point you're committing theft. And really, what people don't understand is that when Washington invaded Pennsylvania to enforce that whiskey tax, he set the precedent that allowed to enforce the tariff of abominations in South Carolina. So at the time, for federal troops to march on a state, they needed the permission. They had to either be invited by the state legislature, or if the legislature was not in session, they had to be called in by the governor. Now, the state legislature of Pennsylvania never invited Washington. The governor specifically said, "Stay the hell out. We don't want you." Yet, nevertheless, he did it anyway, unconstitutionally. So the Constitution didn't even last one president. Not one president. Not one president. So the idea, not to get sidetracked, but the idea that a piece of paper can stop tyranny is how absurd. But anyway, so when he invaded Pennsylvania, they just did the same thing when it came time to enforce tariffs in South Carolina in the 1830s. They said, well, hey, look, Washington did it. We don't need to wait for the legislature to invite us. We don't need for the governor to invite us. We just march right in. And that's what Andrew Jackson did. So when it came time for Lincoln to do it, it was real nice and simple. You had all, 50 years of legal precedent supporting this, despite the fact that it was clearly unconstitutional. So, you're not going to, you won't hear these things in public schools. Uh, And it goes on and on and on. Rothbard did some great lectures on history. I think everybody should check out this. He's got a series of lectures on YouTube that I think it's called "The End of Laissez-Faire" or something along that line, and he really goes into some extremely, extremely important topics like compulsory cartelization and how that affected the railroad industry. And I think when people start to hear that story and they understand all the economic history after the Civil War and the time directly after that, it really draws into light everything happening today and it really puts it into a better perspective.
Yeah. Rothbard's The Progressive Era was really eye-opening. I read that after Anatomy of the State, and just every single monopoly you've ever heard of has been a government creation. I the idea of a true monopoly, I don't think that exists.
Well, there's no such thing. There are monopolies, but there's no such thing as in a free market, there's no such thing as a malevolent monopoly, right? There's no,
Right.
you know what I mean? As a poorly behaved monopoly, because at that point, competitors are going to move in and steal your market share.
Right. Exactly. Everyone has this idea of the malevolent monopoly, but the monopolies that aren't government created, like Amazon and Google, they're monopolies because they're just better. Everyone loves them, and they've done so much for us and for freedom.
And if you think about it, they don't even have 100% of market share, right?
No.
Amazon still competes with Target and Walmart and, God only knows what other companies, but the real monopolies, people pay no attention to. And what's funny is you look at things like the police and the roads, and these are suffering from the all the normal usual ailments that you would expect to see from a malevolent monopoly, right? Lack of accountability. Who cares about the quality of our product? They have to buy it. Go take a ride down your local interstate, wherever you live in the whole country, in the whole world, and you can see the quality of the roads. So, the monopolies that are right in front of our face, we're taught not to see. But those are the bad ones. I'm thankful for Amazon because within 2 days, they'll bring anything to my front door. The state will, the only time they're coming to my front door is to shoot and kill me, you know?
Right.
So,
Yeah, I often bring up to people, here the roads they're just terrible. There's cracks all over them, and they ruin your tires. And I'm just like, if Jeff Bezos was in charge of the roads, wouldn't it be infinitely better? You know it would be.
oh,
And
it'd be two different worlds.
it would be affordable too. That's what people don't understand is that you're paying for the roads with your taxes. It's not free. I hate that when someone brings up, well, we already have the funding for the roads and the libraries and all this crap.
It's just nonsensical. And then they'll say that to you, and then in next year when the election comes, they're gonna say, "Oh, by God, we have to go out there and vote for more money for our roads, or we need a new library."
You're right,
It's brainwashing. It's indoctrination.
for sure.
Um, Alex Utopium, who writes for the New Libertarian blog, has an article that he wrote about a week ago, maybe two, about he wrote a review of Walter Block's book, The Privatization of Roads and Highways. And one of the things I love about that book is that Walter Block actually calculates. You can look at sectors of the economy that are socialized and privatized, and you can compare the different levels of efficiency. And he's able to calculate that if the roads, because the roads have been socialized, the inefficiency has been increased to a degree such that it has resulted in about 35,000 deaths per year on the highways. So if you think about that, that's worse than the wars. That's worse than all these different things. And you know, when people open their newspaper, they turn on the news and they see a car full of dead children on the road. They don't think anything of it. They think, oh well, why were they driving crazy or something like that. They never actually think to blame the owner of the road. I mean, could you imagine if you're going down the aisle in Walmart and you slip and fall and you break your leg? What do? You sue Walmart. But if you get into an
Right.
accident on the roads, then they sue you.
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, unless it's absolutely insane, you're not going to get away with suing the government.
No,
And
no, never,
yeah,
no.
yeah, that is interesting. I've never thought about the roads that way. But yeah, if yeah, oh man, I can think of
And
any examples.
the other
Yeah.
thing about the roads too is that if a couple things. First of all, if the roads were privatized, then the police wouldn't be able to hide behind shrubs and trees to extort and leech off of productive people. They wouldn't be able to do this on a private road, right? Because the owner of the road would set their own rules and regulations. So the cops wouldn't be able to walk up to your car and say, "What's that smell?" or let me see your license or let me see your registration. That wouldn't work. And the other thing
Yep.
about the roads is that we wouldn't really know how the roads would function because we haven't applied free market entrepreneurial economics to the roads. So, for example, maybe you and I would be owners of different roads that compete with each other, and you want to take market share from me. So you're trying to innovate and you're trying to come up with better, higher quality products, and we're both trying to lower the price and make the roads as safe as possible. So who knows? Maybe there would be a specific lane with rubber bumpers on both sides, surrounded by cotton or something, or pillows for drunk drivers only. Who knows? You know what I mean? There would be all kinds of crazy solutions that we can't ever know because the state prohibits this innovation.
Yep. And all of the market innovations to date have prevented deaths. So I mean, it really doesn't make any sense to say though that we can't make roads that will, you know, save lives. And then it's the same case for the private security. As you think about law enforcement, there's practically no innovation in that. Maybe save for body cams, but if you had a
Which they
uh,
turn off.
right, they turn them off, and if you had a private company,
That would never
that
happen, right?
right, I'm sure we would get to a point where you could look at an individual officer's record and you could see everything that he's doing, and it would be more localized too. You'd have police officers or private security officers that operate within a small area, know what they're doing. One of the things, being a veteran, I've noticed is that the military has no specialization, and that's the first thing that the market does. The market says, "Oh, okay, we need somebody to sit here and answer the phones, and that's your job," because it's more efficient that way. But what happens in government is they will say, okay, you're going to answer the phone for an hour here, and then you're going to go over here. It's just like with math and the way I was taught in public education. We would do one subject one week, a completely different subject the next week, and then another subject. And then you go back to that first subject and you don't remember anything from
Right, right. Uh, especially when it comes to the military, I think it's in Chaos Theory by Bob Murphy that he gives this example. But could you imagine, like, if you are the entrepreneur or the CEO of an insurance company, and you have policies out on all the different skyscrapers in Manhattan, right? Could you imagine what kind of incentive you have to prevent a terrorist attack, to prevent a 9/11 kind of event?
it?
In a free market,
Yeah.
if you were the insurance owner on those policies, rather than being having to deal with the possibility of paying to rebuild all of downtown Manhattan, which would be trillions of dollars, wouldn't it be wiser for that CEO of the insurance company to have a well functioned military off the coast, just waiting and ready for any sort of military provocation or terrorist activity? But we don't have that. So instead, we have to deal with, you know, the state's military, and we saw their incentive to prevent attack on 9/11. So,
Yeah.
it's all about efficiency, and it applies to courts, police, roads, military. Look at the amount of innovation just in a simple cell phone. Look how far we've come since 1985 till today in phones. Or look at televisions, or look at cars, or any sort of private commercial product. Just look at the innovation, the changes that have happened. Now compare that with the classroom, which has remained the same since the 1800s, right? Still the same. The teacher has the blackboard in front of the class, and the kids sit at the desk and they listen to the lecture. Or you look at the roads, it's the same thing. It's just a flat piece of rock that the state uses to extort us. So I mean, there's no innovation in socialism because there's no accountability in the market. There's no entrepreneurship, and that is really the strength of free market economics.
Hmm. Yeah. And being, uh, knowing people that have kids in public education, they will have their kids be in the classroom all day being taught by a teacher who is paid to, as specialize in teaching them a subject. And then they will go home and go on the internet and learn what they were supposed to be learning in
Right.
class.
Right.
And most of the time being self-motivated
Yeah.
to do it on their own. And and then they come back and they do well on the test, and then they're like, what is this teacher doing? He or she's doing an amazing job. Well, no, they didn't teach them anything. They're learning on the internet. I
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. Ron Paul's got a book, School Revolution, where he says exactly what you just said about how it's all about, especially particularly self-motivation, and how you learn what the state tells you to learn, where under like a more libertarian friendly curriculum, one more of like homeschooling, it's really more self-directed, and it really it's based on the interests of the student. And what he says is you don't really ever stop learning. We have this idea where, well, oh, I hit senior year and I graduated and that's it, I'm done with
Mhm.
school now. But it doesn't really work like that. And if you really teach the child, to that you don't ever stop learning, it really kind of changes everything, and they really become more dependent on themselves and more reliant on themselves and what they
Right.
want to do.
Yeah. And well, the elites in Rome would have private tutors, and they would teach them one on one about subjects. Yet you're not. I mean, in today's economy, where we have more purchasing power than anyone, I mean, it's not even close. We can't have private one on one instruction for different subjects, or we can't have specialized learning. It's insane.
It's crazy, crazy.
Yeah. So I just want to ask you one last thing. If you were God and you could have everyone read one book and just understand it on a fundamental level,
Oh man.
what book would you pick and why?
Well, off the top of my head, the first book that comes to mind is ironically a fiction book,
Okay.
and that is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein. That is, to me, that's my favorite book that's ever been written. And it's about a anarcho-capitalist revolution on the moon, but it really encompasses so much, and it really teaches people so much about what a libertarian society can and should look like. And plus, I think everybody's going to enjoy it too. So definitely check out The Moon's a Harsh Mistress by Heinlein. I really can't imagine anybody not enjoying that book if you are a part of the liberty movement.
Awesome. That's great. So everybody follow, what is it? At Sally May, uh, what is it? At
At Sally
Sally
Mayweather, yes, on
Mayweather. That's
Twitter.
it. On Twitter. And go to saltheagorist.com. Subscribe to his podcast. A lot of great content.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, no
Appreciate it.
problem.